Hello, this lecture is on the Civil War. War has a psychological dimension. The issue of civilian morale can be as important as the production of artillery shells. The Civil War was a total war, and the Northern generals were aware that they could not be victorious by gaining strategic objects or by occupying enemy territory. It was paramount to destroy the Southern whites' will to resist and to convince them that they had no choice but to give up the idea of seceding from the Union. At war's end, there were 620,000 soldiers dead. Economically, the costs were severe. Southerners were especially hard hit. Many of their lands and property were in ruins. But the war also brought much needed change. There was the abolition of slavery and the preservation of the Union. Conflict arose from a fundamental difference between two different ideals of society. The South saw itself as paternalistic, generous, and prosperous, and defended slavery on the grounds of race. The North, inspired by evangelical Protestantism, believed in the importance of individualism and liberty. Northerners also wanted to keep the Union intact. In the 1860 election, voter participation was 81.2%, the highest number since recording began in 1824. Although Abraham Lincoln's Electoral College vote of 180 was far larger than the 72 votes of his main Democratic opponent, John C. Breckinridge, Lincoln only received 39.8% of the popular vote. He was not on the ballot in the South. It offended Southerners that Lincoln and the Republican Party had won despite no support in the South. It was insulting that the Republican Party was victorious with its anti-slavery platform. Before the 6-foot, 4-inch tall Lincoln took office, South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, and by February the following year, 6 more states, all in the Deep South, had joined South Carolina in forming the Confederate States of America, led by President Jefferson Davis. The new Confederate government had many key people who were considered moderates, and it is notable that the Confederate Constitution resembled the US Constitution. The South did not succeed to create a slaveholders' utopia. The South's goal was to restore the Union as it had been before the rise of the Republican Party. The outgoing President James Buchanan had made no attempt to coerce the South back into the Union, and a number of Northerners were content to let the South go in peace. Most Northerners, however, wanted forceful action to preserve the Union. There was a last-minute effort to save the Union. In Congress, support grew for a plan put forward by Senator John Crittenden, the essence of which was to settle the problem of slavery in the territories by extending the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean. Lincoln rejected this plan because he did not think it would end secession and because he viewed it as a rejection of the principles on which he had been elected. When Lincoln took office, he discovered that he must either quickly resupply the federal garrison in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, or surrender it to the new Confederacy. He opted for resupply. But before the supplies arrived, South Carolina forces opened fire on Fort Sumter on April the 12th and captured it the following day. Lincoln called out the northern state militias to suppress the insurrection in the South, but this action drove other slave states to join the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina left the Union. They could not support a government willing to use force to maintain the Union. When the war began, federal troops were sent to Maryland, and the writ of habeas corpus was suspended, and pro-secession Marylanders were arrested. President Lincoln was behind these harsh decisions to make Washington secure. 3 other border states, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, stayed within the Union, even though many within these states supported the South and wanted to maintain solidarity with the slave-holding regions. In the North, the most responded eagerly to what they expected would be a short war. The war technically was not a struggle between slave and free states. Quote, more than anything else, conflicting views on the right of secession determined the ultimate division of states and the choices of individuals in areas where sentiment was divided. Historian Paul Johnson writes that the Civil War was, quote, the most characteristic religious event because both sides were filled with moral righteousness for their own cause and moral detestation of the attitudes of their opponents. According to Johnson, Lincoln was a case of American exceptionalism because in his humble, untaught ways, he was a kind of moral genius such as is seldom seen in life and hardly ever at the summit of politics. Certainly, he was a rare lawyer. In 1861, to Congress, Lincoln explained what was at stake. And this issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, too few in numbers to control an administration according to organic law in any case, can always, upon the pretenses made in this case or on any other pretenses, or arbitrarily without any pretense, break up their government and thus practically put an end to free government upon the earth. It forces us to ask, is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? So, viewing the issue no choice was left but to call out the war power of the government and so to resist force employed for its destruction by force for its preservation. Powerful words from the president. In 1861, neither the North nor the South was ready for war. The South did not establish a draft until 1862, and the North not until 1863. Initially, the South had to rely on imported arms and munitions because it could not produce its own. Nonetheless, the South continued to have trouble acquiring adequate clothing and food throughout the duration of the war. Both the North and the South had trouble financing the war. Both sides had to end the tradition of hard money and minimal government. The new norm was raising taxes, issuing war bonds, and printing paper money. It was a difficult transition for many Americans who had been unaccustomed to paying taxes to the national government. In the North, inflation was serious. In the South, inflation was devastating. Shortage of revenue was not the only serious problem. Both sides were plagued with problems of leadership. While the Confederacy was unified behind the goal of winning independence, this apparent unity concealed separation between extreme state righters and those who supported a strong central authority. As for the North, it had a two-party system that provided traditional channels for discussing differences of opinion. With military leadership, Lincoln struggled to find competent generals to lead the war. At least Lincoln was a far more effective chief executive than Jefferson Davis. While Lincoln greatly expanded his wartime powers by declaring martial law, Davis concerned himself mainly with military issues and showed little interest in civilian morale and economic problems. Davis had little influence with state governments, which sometimes impeded the war effort. Davis had a flawed personality. He admitted, quote, "In my young youth, I was overwilling to fight." Davis lacked the imagination and an understanding of society beyond his own circle. On slavery, he had stated, quote, "I have no fear of insurrection, no more dread of our slaves than I have of our cattle. Our slaves are happy and contented." Paul Johnson writes that Davis, quote, "was like so many other well-read and well-meaning people in the South, the victim of its own policy of concentrating its limited media and publishing resources on indoctrinating its own people." A better military man than a politician, Davis got distracted with trivialities. He was a short-tempered man who did not learn from his mistakes. The Civil War has been called the first modern war because of railroads, mass-produced weapons, iron-plated warships, rifled guns and artillery, and trench warfare. The Confederacy had only a fraction of the industrial capacity of its opponent. Its population was much smaller than the population of the Union. 9 million in the South compared to 22 million in the North. But the South did have a few advantages. It didn't have many, of course, when we look at the various productivity and various things that one would need for fighting the war, but it did have a few advantages. The South was, of course, fighting in its own backyard. There was the psychological aspect of Southerners fighting in defense of their own homeland. Unlike the North, the South did not have extremely long supply lines, nor was the South burdened with the problem of occupying captured areas, as was the case with Northern troops. The North also had to commit a greater proportion of its men away from the home front than did the South. And why was that? Well, the South had slaves to do much of the labor. The military strategy of the Northern forces was threefold: blockade the southern coast, take control of the Confederate capital located in Richmond, Virginia, and take control of the Mississippi River. And this would prevent Southerners from receiving the Southern troops from receiving much needed supplies. By mid-1862, Northern troops gained control over most of the Mississippi River. Earlier setbacks of Union forces in Virginia led to a stalemate there. Southern strategy, in part, relied on political support. Oh, I should add, the North was successful, the Navy was successful in blockading Confederate forces throughout the war. So of the strategy, the North was in pretty good shape with two of the three. Now, as for the Southern strategy, in part relied on political support. It was the hope of Southern leaders that the Confederacy would be recognized as an independent nation. They desired a favorable relationship with France and Great Britain. On this, the South was unsuccessful. In Great Britain, public opinion opposed slavery. Economically, the cotton card was weak too. Cotton diplomacy failed when British stocks of cotton remained strong because of cotton from Egypt and India. The British got their cotton elsewhere. The British were also reluctant to interfere with the Union's blockade, since the British had a history of using naval blockades in previous conflicts, previous wars. Southern weaknesses became more obvious, whereas Northern farms had access to agricultural machinery. Southern farmers were hampered by the lack of foundries and machine shops for farming equipment in the South. Many Southern farms converted from cotton to farm crops, but food shortages were common. One reason was the loss of the major food producing state, Tennessee, to Union forces early in the war. A lack of salt to preserve meat and a serious drought in the summer months of 1862 resulted in a poor harvest. Another problem was that Southern railroads carried less from food producing areas to soldiers and cities in the field and in the cities. Quote, railroads within Confederate war zones began to show significant wear and tear as armies crossed their paths, fought for their control, ripped up their rails, and destroyed their locomotives. The Confederacy found it difficult to finance the war effort also. And as I mentioned earlier, the South had a serious problem with inflation. They had runaway inflation. There was hardship on the home front for Northerners and Southern non-slave owners. Most of the population lived on farms or in small towns less than 2,500 people. Thus, many soldiers were farmers. With the men fighting, farm women did the plowing, planting, and harvesting, in addition to the regular work of cooking, washing, milking, butter making, cleaning, sewing, and the rearing of children. Those who found it too difficult either sold out, went bankrupt, or abandoned farming until their husbands returned, if their husbands returned. By 1863, both sides were experiencing labor shortages, inflation, and dissension. The North, however, met the challenge more effectively. Yes, the cotton textile industry in the North was hurt, but industries directly related to the war effort flourished. Industries such as arm manufacture, ready-made clothing, and railroads. Throughout the war, wages tended to be 20% behind price increases. This meant that there were episodes of dissent in the North and in the South. The Copperheads, known as the Peace Democrats, these were the Democrats that still remained in the North. They contributed to a volatile brew of political and ethnic antagonism. And there was a number of anti-draft protests in several cities, including New York City. In 1863, the military value of emancipation became clear even to those Northerners who had no moral qualms about slavery. On January 1st, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect, which said all slaves under rebel control would be free. It turned out to be a brilliant political move as the war was transformed. The Emancipation Act increased the slaves' incentive to escape as Northern troops approached. And soon, the large numbers of freed refugees became an issue. On plantations, slaves increasingly shirked their duties or ran away. By the end of the war, 186,000 Blacks, 10% of all Union soldiers, had served in the Union Army. Also, in 1863, the Confederate thrust north to Gettysburg failed. This is a small community in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There was a 3-day campaign, a 3-day battle fought on July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd. And this ended up being an important victory for Union forces. It was a much needed victory, for many reasons, but including morale, because the Union Army had not done as well as some had hoped. Well, the Union experienced more success in the South in the following year. By 1864, Georgia and South Carolina were devastated by Northern forces. On the demoralization of the white South, no military campaign was more successful than General William Sherman's march from Atlanta to Savannah. Sherman invaded Georgia with a host of nearly 100,000 men in May 1864 and fought his way into Atlanta 4 months later. Commenting on his tactics of destruction, Sherman declared that war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out. On September the 1st, Sherman's forces torched Atlanta. Well, the march that followed itself never encountered much resistance. Sherman lost about 800 men, a fraction of the 30,000 he lost taking Atlanta. Fanning out over an area as much as 30 miles wide, Sherman's bombers destroyed shops, factories, rail lines, and anything of value to the Southern war effort. They foraged and destroyed the crops so crucial to the South's food supply, and sometimes plundered the civilian in their way. For the South, Sherman's march was grim news. He had intended to bring the war home to those who caused it, and he succeeded. A sense of utter helplessness descended over Georgia. A resident of Augusta, wondering why that city had not yet fallen to Sherman, finally concluded that they, quote, they have only to come and take it when they are ready. But even more devastating as far as the white South was concerned was the phenomenon of thousands and thousands of their slaves fleeing to the safety of Sherman's army. The march eventually resembled a comet where a small head of soldiers with a great tail of runaway slaves. Blacks had voted with their feet as soon as the Union Army entered the Confederacy, but never in such numbers as they did in 1864. Sherman fought no major battles during his march to the sea, that is from Atlanta and making his way to the sea. And he destroyed no Southern armies, but he succeeded better than he intended in rending the fabric of Southern society. Lincoln's re-election was assured. The president's running mate was Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Unionist. The Union became the first warring nation in history to hold a contested national election. Lincoln received 55% of the vote, and Democratic George B. McClellan got 48%. The Electoral College margin was 212 to 21, a small number because 11 secession states did not participate. Entering 1865, the Confederacy began to fall apart. Union forces finally took Richmond on April the 3rd. On April 9, General Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Grant. On April 14th, the war-weary president went to Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary. then tragedy. Southern actor John Wilkes Booth went to Lincoln's box and shot the president, shot him in the head. The next day, Lincoln was dead. He was the first American president assassinated. The war profoundly changed the United States. The death of 620,000 men left many women bereft of husbands and either encouraged or forced them to seek roles other than those of wife and mother. The war was both an economic stimulus and a retarding agent. Northern industry underwent impressive development, but the South experienced destruction and dislocation. During the war, Blacks played an important role as historical actors on the larger scene. Service by Blacks during the Civil War on the home front, in the Army, and the Navy was notable. As for states' rights, they were dealt a severe blow. The war gave the federal government predominance over the state, even though the states continued to have primary responsibility for most functions of government. The permanence of the Union had been debated and sometimes challenged since its conception. Now it was settled. Of course, the war had a profound impact on African Americans. The Civil War saw the abolition of slavery. Free labor was now to be triumphed everywhere in America. Never again would any American law, federal or state, uphold the institution of slavery. Union victory, however, did not mean total victory for Blacks. 4 million African Americans were free, but not yet equal. For former slaves, mobility was often the first fruit of liberty. Many went to towns or cities or sought out spouses and family members separated by sale. The freedmen established churches and made vigorous efforts to provide for education. These were all good things. But schools were underfunded, segregated, and sometimes the target of vigilante attacks. The freedmen lacked the capital to buy land or the equipment to work it. And white Southerners, on the whole, opposed selling land to Blacks. White landowners needed the labor of the Blacks, and a number of labor arrangements developed, the most widespread being sharecropping. For years, Black enfranchisement irritated many in the Democratic Party. When the Southern states were admitted to the Union, and that went through a process, it didn't happen immediately, Democrats became politically active and were assisted by the Ku Klux Klan and other vigilantes. A larger military presence in the South was necessary to protect Black rights and preserve the Black electorate. This did not happen. African Americans would have to wait many decades to realize major social and political advances. Thank you.